When my cousin announced to 40 wedding guests that I was technically not even family because I was adopted, I waited for her to finish her cruel speech, then stood up and revealed the DNA evidence that I was actually our grandfather's biological child, making me more legitimate family than anyone who'd been excluding me. Before I dive into this story of family secrets and the most shocking DNA revelation imaginable, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever been treated like an outsider by people who should have embraced you, and subscribe to True Revenge for more stories of justice served through scientific truth. My name is Amanda, I'm 32 years old, and for my entire life I believed I was the adopted daughter who should be grateful for any acceptance from my real family. This story begins with a lifetime of subtle exclusion and ends with a DNA test that rewrote everything I thought I knew about who I belonged to. I was adopted when I was 6 months old by Richard and Carol Stevens, a loving couple who had struggled with infertility for years. They never hid my adoption from me. In fact, they celebrated it as the miracle that brought me into their lives. My adoptive parents were wonderful, supportive people who made sure I always knew I was chosen and wanted. The problem wasn't with my parents. The problem was with the extended family, who never quite let me forget that I wasn't really a Stevens. My adoptive father, Richard, was the youngest of 4 siblings in a tight-knit family dominated by his older sister, Margaret. Aunt Margaret had 3 children, Kevin, Lisa, and Brian, who were all within a few years of my age. She was the self-appointed family matriarch who organized gatherings, maintained family traditions, and seemed to view my adoption as a generous act of charity rather than a normal family expansion. From my earliest memories, family gatherings involved subtle but persistent reminders that I was different. While my cousins received elaborate birthday parties and expensive gifts, my celebrations were always more modest. When family photos were taken, I was often positioned at the edge of groups or asked to take the photo instead of being in it. "Amanda can take this one since she's good with cameras," Aunt Margaret would say, effectively excluding me from yet another family portrait. Comments about my adoption were never overtly cruel, but they were constant. During family dinners, stories would be shared about family traits and genetic similarities that obviously didn't include me. "Lisa has Grandpa's eyes, and Kevin definitely inherited the Stevens stubbornness," Aunt Margaret would observe, then glance at me with a smile that felt performatively inclusive. "And we're so lucky to have Amanda as part of our family too, even though she doesn't have the Stevens genes." These comments made me feel like a permanent guest in my own family, welcomed but never quite belonging. My cousins inherited this attitude from their mother. Kevin, the oldest, was generally indifferent to me but would occasionally make comments about how I should be more grateful for being included in family activities. Brian, the youngest, was mostly kind but would sometimes thoughtlessly refer to me as not really our cousin when introducing me to friends. But Lisa was the worst. 2 years older than me, she seemed to take personal satisfaction in reminding me of my outsider status. She would make comments about how I didn't understand family loyalty because I wasn't really family, or suggest that I was trying too hard to fit in during family gatherings. "It's so sweet how you try to be part of family traditions," she once told me when I was helping prepare Thanksgiving dinner, "but some things are just for people who are actually related." Pattern continued through childhood and into adulthood. During holidays, my cousins would receive family heirlooms and sentimental gifts while I received generic presents. When Grandpa Stevens shared stories about family history, my cousins were included as inheritors of that legacy, while I was treated as an interested observer. "These stories are about your heritage," Grandpa would tell Kevin, Lisa, and Brian. Then he'd turn to me with kindness but clear distinction, and Amanda gets to learn about the family that chose to love her. The difference was subtle but consistent. I wasn't part of the family history, I was someone who had been graciously allowed to observe it. This dynamic became more painful as I got older and began to understand the emotional impact of always being categorized as separate from my relatives. I loved my adoptive parents deeply and never questioned their love for me, but the extended family's treatment made me feel like I was perpetually earning my place rather than simply belonging. The situation reached a breaking point during my cousin Kevin's wedding last summer. Kevin was marrying Sarah, a woman he'd dated for 3 years. The wedding was a large affair with 200 guests, including most of our extended family. I had been included in wedding planning discussions and had assumed I would be treated as any other family member during the celebration. But Aunt Margaret had other plans. During the reception dinner, Aunt Margaret stood up to give a toast about family and tradition. She spoke beautifully about the Stevens family legacy, the importance of family bonds, and her hopes for Kevin and Sarah's future together. Then she turned to me. "I also want to acknowledge Amanda, who has been such a wonderful addition to our family through adoption," she said with a warm smile that somehow felt condescending. "Amanda, you should feel so grateful that you've been included in all our family celebrations over the years. Not every adopted child is lucky enough to be embraced by their adoptive family's extended relatives the way we've embraced you." The room fell silent as 200 wedding guests processed this backhanded compliment that simultaneously acknowledged my presence and reminded everyone that I didn't really belong. But Aunt Margaret wasn't finished. "I know Amanda sometimes struggles with feeling like a real part of the family," she continued. "But we want her to know that even though she doesn't have Stephen's blood, we consider her almost like a real relative." Almost like a real relative. The phrase hung in the air like a slap. I felt my face burning with embarrassment and humiliation. 200 people were staring at me, many looking uncomfortable with Aunt Margaret's speech, but no one was challenging her characterization of my place in the family. Kevin, the groom, said nothing. Lisa was smirking. Brian looked embarrassed but remained silent. Even my adoptive parents, who were sitting across the room, seemed frozen by the public nature of the humiliation. "We're so proud of Amanda for accepting her place in our family structure," Aunt Margaret concluded, "and we hope she continues to appreciate how lucky she is that we've always included her despite not being biological family." I sat in stunned silence as Aunt Margaret finished her toast and wedding guests offered awkward applause. The message was crystal clear. I was a charity case who should be grateful for scraps of acceptance from people who were doing me a favor by tolerating my presence. That night, lying in my hotel room, I made a decision that would change everything. For 2 years, I had been sitting on DNA test results that I'd ordered out of curiosity about my biological heritage. I'd never shared the results with anyone because they had revealed information that seemed impossible and potentially disruptive to family dynamics I hadn't wanted to complicate. But Aunt Margaret's speech had stripped away any obligation I felt to protect family feelings. If they wanted to make a biological relationship the measure of family legitimacy, then I would provide them with the complete biological picture. The DNA test results, which I'd received from 23andMe 18 months earlier, had revealed something shocking. I shared significant genetic markers with several members of the Stevens family. Initially, I'd assumed this was a mistake or a coincidence. Plenty of people share some genetic similarities without being closely related. But when I'd uploaded my raw DNA data to additional analysis sites and compared it against Stephen's family members who had also done genetic testing, the results were undeniable. I was biologically related to the Stevens family. More specifically, I was biologically related to Grandpa Stevens. The genetic analysis indicated that I shared approximately 25% of my DNA with Richard Stevens Sr., my adoptive grandfather. This percentage was consistent with a grandparent-grandchild relationship. I was not just adopted into the Stevens family, I was actually a biological member of the Stevens family. The implications were staggering. Grandpa Stevens was my biological grandfather, then one of his children was my biological parent. Since I'd been adopted by his son Richard, the most likely explanation was that I was Richard's biological daughter who had been placed for adoption under circumstances the family had chosen to keep secret. But there was another possibility that the DNA testing couldn't definitively resolve. I could be the biological child of one of Richard's siblings, making me the niece who had been adopted by her uncle. Either way, I had more Stevens DNA than any of my cousins who had spent their lives treating me as a genetic outsider. I'd kept this information secret for 2 years because I hadn't known how to handle it. The revelation had implications for family relationships, legal issues around inheritance, and emotional dynamics I hadn't felt prepared to navigate. But Aunt Margaret's wedding speech had eliminated my concerns about disrupting family harmony. If they wanted to use genetics as the basis for family hierarchy, then genetics would determine the new family hierarchy. The next family gathering was Grandpa Stephen's 85th birthday party, held at Aunt Margaret's house 6 weeks after Kevin's wedding. The entire extended family would be there, the perfect audience for my revelation. I arrived at the party with a folder containing printed copies of my DNA test results, genetic analysis reports, and comparison charts showing my relationship to various Stevens family members. I'd also prepared a brief presentation explaining the science behind the genetic testing and what the results meant for our family relationships. During dinner, the conversation naturally turned to family history and genetics, as it often did during Stephen's gatherings. Aunt Margaret was discussing inherited traits and making her usual observations about which family members resembled which ancestors. "It's so interesting how genetics works," she said, looking around the table. "You can really see the Stevens features in Kevin's jawline, and Lisa definitely has the Stevens eye shape. It's wonderful how family traits get passed down through the generations." Then she looked at me with that familiar mixture of pity and condescension. "Of course, Amanda doesn't have any of our genetic traits, but she's still a valued member of our family despite not having Stephen's DNA." That was my cue. "Actually, Aunt Margaret," I said calmly, pulling out my folder, "I do have Stephen's DNA. Quite a lot of it, actually." The room went quiet. Aunt Margaret looked confused. "Amanda, sweetheart, you know you're adopted. You don't have Stephen's genetics." I opened my folder and pulled out the first DNA analysis report. According to 23andMe and 3 additional genetic testing services, I share approximately 25% of my DNA with Grandpa Stevens. That's the percentage consistent with a biological grandparent-grandchild relationship. I handed the report to Grandpa Stevens, who was sitting at the head of the table, looking bewildered. I also share significant genetic markers with several other Stevens family members, indicating that I'm not just adopted into this family, I'm actually a biological member of this family. The silence in the room was deafening. Aunt Margaret was staring at me like I was speaking a foreign language. "That's impossible," she said firmly. "Amanda, you were adopted as a baby. We know your biological parents weren't related to our family." "Do we?" I asked, pulling out additional documentation. "Because my genetic testing indicates otherwise. I have more Stevens DNA than some people at this table." I handed out copies of the comparative analysis showing my genetic relationship to each family member present. For example, I share 12.5% of my DNA with Uncle Robert, which is consistent with a biological aunt-niece relationship. I share 6.8% of my DNA with you, Aunt Margaret, also consistent with an aunt-niece relationship. Aunt Margaret was scanning the genetic report with obvious panic. "But most interestingly," I continued, "I share 23.2% of my DNA with Dad, which is significantly higher than the typical uncle-niece relationship but lower than a typical parent-child relationship." I turned to my adoptive father, who had gone pale. "Dad, did you know that genetic testing suggests we share more DNA than an uncle and niece typically would, but less than a father and daughter typically would?" The implication hung in the air. The genetic results suggested a more complex biological relationship than a simple adoption scenario. My father was staring at his plate, his hand shaking slightly. "Richard," Grandpa Stevens said slowly, "what is Amanda talking about?" There was a long silence before my father finally spoke. "She's talking about the fact that she's my biological daughter." The room erupted. Aunt Margaret dropped her fork with a clatter. Kevin and Lisa were staring at their uncle with shock. Brian looked like he was trying to solve a complex math problem. "Your biological daughter?" Aunt Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "But she was adopted. You and Carol adopted her because you couldn't have children." "We couldn't have children together," my father corrected quietly. "But I had a relationship before I married Carol. Amanda is my daughter from that relationship. When her biological mother couldn't care for her, Carol and I decided to adopt her rather than explain the complicated family situation." Truth was finally out. I wasn't adopted into the Stevens family. I was a biological Stevens who had been raised as an adopted Stevens to avoid family drama. So Amanda has been a biological Stevens this entire time? Lisa asked, her voice hollow. Yes, my father confirmed. She has more legitimate claim to Stevens' heritage than anyone else in her generation. The irony was overwhelming. For 32 years, my cousins had treated me as a genetic outsider who should be grateful for inclusion in their family. In reality, I was the only grandchild who was unquestionably a biological descendant of Grandpa Stevens. Aunt Margaret, who had spent decades making subtle and not-so-subtle comments about my lack of Stevens' DNA, had been publicly corrected by science itself. But why didn't you tell us? Aunt Margaret asked, though her voice lacked its usual authority. Because we thought it would be easier for everyone if Amanda were simply our adopted daughter rather than explaining that she was Richard's biological child from a previous relationship. My mother, Carol, spoke for the first time since my revelation. We wanted to protect everyone from complicated questions and potential family conflict. So you let everyone treat her like she didn't belong? Brian asked, apparently beginning to understand the implications of what had been happening. We didn't realize how much the family was emphasizing biological relationships, my father admitted. If we had known that Amanda was being made to feel like an outsider because of genetics, we would have corrected that immediately. I looked around the table at family members who were processing the fact that their genetic hierarchy had been completely wrong for 3 decades. So when Aunt Margaret said I should be grateful for being included despite not having Stephen's blood, I said calmly, she was actually saying I should be grateful for being included in my own biological family. The statement hung in the air like an indictment. Aunt Margaret was opening and closing her mouth without making a sound. The woman who had spent my entire life making me feel like a charity case had just learned that I had more biological legitimacy in the Stevens family than her own children. Amanda, she finally managed, I had no idea. If I had known… If you had known what? I interrupted. If you had known I was biologically related, you would have treated me better? That says everything about how you view family relationships. The conversation that followed was painful and revealing. My cousins, particularly Lisa, struggled to reconcile their lifelong treatment of me with the new information about my biological status. But you never acted like you belonged, Lisa said defensively. You always seemed like you were trying too hard to fit in. Because you spent 30 years making me feel like I didn't belong, I replied. You told me I should be grateful for inclusion, that I didn't understand family loyalty because I wasn't really family, that family traditions weren't for people like me. The full impact of their behavior was becoming clear to everyone at the table. They had excluded and condescended to a biological family member because they had assumed she was genetically unrelated. Grandpa Stevens, who had been silent through most of this exchange, finally spoke. Amanda, honey, I owe you an apology. We all do. You should never have been made to feel like you didn't belong in your own family. But you did make me feel that way, I said. For 32 years, you treated me like I was lucky to be included rather than like I was inherently part of the family. And now we know I was more biologically related to this family than some of the people who were excluding me. The genetic testing had revealed something else interesting. Due to some genetic variations in family history, I actually shared more Stevens' DNA than Kevin and Lisa did. They were still biological Stevens, but genetic recombination had given me a higher percentage of identifiable Stevens genetic markers. In other words, if we were ranking family members by Stevens genetics, I would be near the top of the list. The evening ended with awkward apologies and promises to do better from family members who were clearly uncomfortable with having their behavior exposed so definitively. But the damage to relationships was done. You can't spend 3 decades treating someone as a genetic outsider and then simply apologize when you discover they were actually a genetic insider all along. The aftermath of my DNA revelation was complex and long-lasting. My relationship with my parents improved significantly once the truth was out. They apologized for allowing family dynamics to develop that made me feel excluded and expressed regret that they hadn't corrected misconceptions about my biological status earlier. "We thought keeping it simple would be easier for everyone," my mother explained. "We didn't realize that simple was causing you to be treated as less than family." My relationship with extended family members required more work. Some relatives, particularly my uncles Robert and Thomas, made genuine efforts to acknowledge their past behavior and build better relationships moving forward. But Aunt Margaret struggled to accept the new dynamic. She alternated between over-the-top attempts to include me in family activities and subtle resentment about having her genetic superiority arguments undermined. Lisa had the most difficulty adjusting to the revelation. She'd built much of her identity around being more legitimately Stevens than I was, and learning that the opposite was true challenged her sense of family hierarchy. "It doesn't change anything," she insisted during one family gathering. "You still grew up thinking you were adopted." "But I wasn't adopted in the way you all treated me," I replied. "I was a biological Stevens being raised as an outsider in my own family." The most significant change was in how I viewed myself and my place in the family. For 32 years, I had internalized the message that I should be grateful for acceptance from my real relatives. Learning that I was as real as anyone else in the family was liberating and infuriating in equal measure. I was liberated because I no longer needed to earn my place in a family I biologically belonged to. But I was infuriated because I had spent 3 decades accepting lesser treatment based on false assumptions about genetics. The DNA revelation also raised questions about inheritance and family property that had previously been off limits to me as an adopted family member. Suddenly, discussions about Grandpa's will and family heirlooms took on different significance when I was acknowledged as a biological descendant rather than a grateful adoptee. Most importantly, the experience taught me about the arbitrary nature of family hierarchies based on genetics. My cousins had spent their lives believing they were more legitimate family members because of biology, but when biology actually supported my claim over theirs, they argued that biology didn't matter as much as relationships and shared experiences. Truth was that both biology and relationships matter, but neither should be used as a weapon to exclude family members or make them feel like they don't belong. 2 years after my DNA revelation, family dynamics have settled into a new normal that acknowledges my biological status while still dealing with the emotional aftermath of decades of exclusion. I've chosen to maintain relationships with family members who made genuine efforts to acknowledge their past behavior and build better connections. But I've also established clear boundaries with relatives who continue to minimize the impact of their treatment or suggest that I should get over 30 years of being made to feel like an outsider. The most powerful outcome isn't that I proved my genetic legitimacy, it's that I learned to stop seeking validation from people who had never valued me properly in the first place. Whether I was adopted or biological, I deserve to be treated with respect and inclusion by people who claim to love me. Sometimes the most important revenge isn't punishment, it's simply revealing the truth and letting people confront the reality of their own behavior. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in your own family, whether through adoption, genetics, or any other factor, remember that belonging isn't something you earn through biology or gratitude. It's something you deserve simply by being loved and chosen as family. And sometimes the best response to people who question your legitimacy is to have the scientific evidence that proves you were more legitimate than they ever realized. If you enjoyed this story of family secrets and DNA justice served, please give this video a like and subscribe to True Revenge for more stories of people who discovered the truth was more powerful than they ever imagined. Share your own family DNA surprise stories in the comments below. Have you ever discovered biological relationships that changed your understanding of your family? This story proves that sometimes the most satisfying revenge is simply being right. Thank you for listening to my story of genetic truth and family justice. Sometimes the best way to handle exclusion is to prove that the excluders never had the authority to exclude you in the first place.